Hello everyone, my name is Kalogiannis Georgios. I'm a corporate mechanical engineer and I have 12 years of experience in corporate hiring processes and psychometric tests. As we discussed in our previous video, today we will discuss some real practical examples regarding the SHL Inductive Reasoning module. Now, let's begin with the first task. As we can see, in this example, we have a complex star-shaped object. Now, as we can observe by delving a little bit deeper, this particular sophisticated shape is composed by 6 triangles which are located in the periphery of a hexagon and another 6 triangles inside the area of the inner hexagon. Now, we need 2 patterns in order to find the solution to this task. The first pattern for determining the number and the shapes, the nature of the shapes that are included in the requested subtriangle inside the hexagon, there are 2 patterns. The first pattern refers to the shape of the object that must be contained inside, and the second to the number of the shapes. Now let's start with what kind of shape we need to put inside this particular inner triangle. Well, let's begin with the first triangle on the top of the star. As we can see, this triangle contains 2 black triangles inside. If we look on the respective triangle that is included inside the hexagonal area and it is on the opposite side of the hexagon, there are contained 4 black triangles. Now, if we move on the clockwise direction on the next triangle on the periphery of the star, we see that this particular one includes 4 white sub-triangles inside. Now, if we look on the opposite triangle inside the hexagonal area, we see that the shapes are white triangles as well. So, the same trend is observed on the bottom triangle of the star-shaped object, which again the opposite respective subtriangle in the hexagonal area includes the white circles, and the same goes for the rest of the 2 triangles in the periphery. So we can confidently say that the type of shape that must be included inside the requested triangle must be white circles, the same as this external triangle. Now, as for the number of the circles that must be included inside, we need to find a relation between the external triangle and the inner triangle. Let's begin again with the first triangle on the top of the star-shaped object, and we see that this one includes 2 black subtriangles inside, and the respective subtriangle inside the hexagonal area contains 4. Now, if we move on the adjacent triangle on the periphery of the star, we see that now, this time, it includes 4 white triangles, and the subtriangle on the other side, inside the hexagonal area, has only 2. Therefore, if we pass into the triangle that corresponds to the subtriangle that we are looking for, we see that it has 4 white circles. So, since the number is the same as in the previous triangle that we examined 1 minute before, then we can safely assume that it will have also 2 white circles inside, the same number as the white subtriangles that existed on the opposite side of the previous triangle as well. Therefore, the correct answer from the available answer choices that we have is the B, which includes 2 white circles. Now, at this point, it is essential to mention that based on the given data, we can extract more rules that determine the relationship between the number of the inner shapes inside the inner triangles of the hexagonal area and the respective external ones. But it does not add any value in terms of finding the correct solution, because we already found all the necessary patterns that we need to determine the correct answer from the available answer options. Therefore, it is redundant and we should not spend any more time on this task. Remember commandment number 4. Now let's move on the next task, which is a classical and very typical task that it is almost guaranteed that you will find inside an SHL inductive reasoning test. Now, in this particular task, as we can see, we have a matrix. This matrix is constituted by frames of shapes inside. Now we have sequences that are constructed inside the matrix in rows and in columns. In this particular occasion, it is much simpler to detect a pattern that exists inside the matrix if we analyze the sequences of the rows rather than selecting the sequences of the columns. Now, if we observe the matrix again, we see that we have three complete sequences of rows from which we can infer the pattern in this case. If we observe the sequence of objects in the first row, we see that we have a circle, a heart, a rectangle, a triangle, and a star shape. Now, if we see the second sequence, we observe that we have a square, a circle, a reverse triangle, a star, and a triangle. The only difference between these two sequences is that they have almost all the shapes identical, with the exception that on the second row's sequence we have a reverse triangle in the position instead of a heart shape. Now, if we see the last row sequence, we see that it is exactly identical to the sequence of the first row. Now, the key observation for completing the pattern is that in the second if we take into account the sequences of the first and the second rows, we see that a normal triangle is followed by a reverse triangle, and then we have again a normal triangle. So we can deduce that after a normal triangle, a reverse triangle must follow. Therefore, the overall pattern, as we can summarize it, is that each sequence of rows must contain the same shapes, but whenever a normal triangle appears on one sequence, then on the next sequence we need to have a reverse triangle. So if we go into the third row sequence, we see that we're missing one particular shape. We have a rectangle, we have a square, a circle, a heart, and a star. So the only missing shape that we need is either a triangle or a reverse triangle. Now, because on the previous sequence we ended up with a normal triangle, then on the sequence that exists in the third row we need to have a reverse triangle. So the first shape of the duet of the requested shapes for this particular task must be the reverse triangle. So from the answer choices set that we have available, only the A, D option are candidates for the available correct option. Now if we go into the fourth row sequence, we see again that we have a square, a star, a circle, and a heart. So the missing shape again is either the normal triangle or the reverse triangle. And because in the previous shape we found that we had a reverse triangle, then we can deduce that in this particular sequence we need to have a normal triangle. So the correct answer is the answer option D. Now let's discuss the third task in this particular exam. As we can see here, we have a sequence of shapes that inside all the shapes have some common features. These common features are a line and a particular number of dots. If we focus our attention first in the position of the line, which is the first pattern that we need to decipher, we see that a vertical line in the sequence is always followed by a horizontal line, and this pattern is continuously repeated throughout the sequence. Therefore, since on the last shape we have the appearance of a horizontal line, then it is natural to deduce that in the final shape that we are looking for, we need to have a vertical line. Thus, from the available answer choices, that are provided for these tasks, only the A, B or E can be possible answers. Let's go to the second pattern in the sequence, which is directly correlated with the number of dots included inside each shape. And we see that an even number of dots is always followed by an odd number of dots, and again this pattern is continuously repeated, same as in the previous case. For example, we see on the first shape we have 4 dots, which is an even number of dots. Then on the second shape we have only a single dot, which is an odd number. Then we have again 4 dots, which is an even number, followed by a shape of 3 dots, which is an odd number. So consequently, the final shape must include an even number of dots, and the only answer option that satisfies this criterion is the option B. So this is the correct answer choice that we must take. Now, let's proceed on to the next task of this practice test. Here, as we see, we have a sequence of circles. Inside this particular sequence, there is a number of patterns included inside. We do not need to find every single pattern, we need the bare minimum necessary that allow us to identify the correct alternative from the answer choices that they are given. Now, let's start with the obvious pattern. Every third frame, a grey circle appears. Now, since in the requested frame, 2 frames before there was already a grey frame, we can safely assume that the circle that we are looking for must be a white. Therefore, the possible correct alternatives that we can select are alternative A, C or D. Now let's move on to the next obvious pattern, the appearance of the black circle or the black dot at the center of each circle. Now the pattern, as we see by simply observing the sequence, is that in every second frame the black dot appears in the center of the circle. Now, since in the previous frame of the last frame that we are requested to find already includes a black circle, then we can safely deduce that the alternative that we are looking for must not have the black circle in the middle of the frame. Therefore, from the 3 available answer choices that we have, only answer choice C fulfills this condition. Therefore, it is the correct alternative. Now, let's discuss the following task. This particular task, as we can see, it is composed by a sequence of big square frames. Now, as we can easily observe, each square frame is composed by 4 sub-squares inside. If we observe the first sub-square inside the sequence of the larger squares and the second, we can see that the pattern that exists or the number of shapes should be repeated at least 3 times, and it cannot be repeated more than 4 times. Taking this rule into account, we can observe the last 2 frames in the sequence, and we see that in the location of the first sub-square there is a rainbow shaped pattern. Since it is repeated only 2 times, we can safely deduce that in the following square frame in the sequence, the same rainbow shaped pattern should also be present. Therefore, the possible correct answer can be either answer choice A, B, C or E. Now passing onto the second sub-square inside the square frame, and if we apply the same rule about the pattern that exists, we see that this particular 2 parallel lines pattern should be also present in the following frame, as it has only appeared 1 time inside the sequence. Now if we look again into the set of the possible answers, the answer choices set has shrunk by 1, and now it has become either A, C or E. Passing now onto the third subsquare in the sequence of square frames, we see that it is constituted by a pentagon shape, and this pentagon shape is repeated in the exact same location 3 times in a row. Therefore, we have not reached the 4 times maximum repetition of a particular shape, or thus we can deduce that the following shape should also include a pentagon in the location of the third subsquare. So now the answer choices has shrunk to either A or E. Now we need to decide, in order to decide which one of these two alternatives is the correct one, we need to observe the pattern on the fourth subsquare inside the sequence of the larger square frames. Here there is an implicit pattern that the pattern that must follows in this particular subsquare must be a shape that is already existing inside the sequence of the larger square frames. Therefore, since there is no rule we can deduce about the appearance of this diagonal line with the extra perpendicular line in the middle of the line, then we cannot support the appearance of this particular format in this location. Thus, we need to assume the correct alternative that we're looking for is answer choice E. Passing on the next task, we have here a classical example which for finding the solution we need to dissect and analyze each particular shape independently in order to find a moving pattern. This is very common in all the inductive reasoning tests. It is almost guaranteed 100% that you will encounter at least one question or task like this, and the way to recognize it pretty much immediately is when you have multiple shapes and there is some form of movement inside. But now, let's focus our attention on this particular case. Let's begin with the first shape. Let's say the triangle. If we follow the displacement of the triangle in its following frame in the sequence, we see that it moves diagonally by one position with its following frame. Therefore, since in the last frame the triangle, as we can see, this position pretty much near the close end of the diagonal of the fictitious diagonal line, we can safely assume that the following location of the triangle must be on the top right corner of the square. But this is not very helpful, as every single frame here, as we can see, includes the triangle in this particular location. So let's move into analyzing the displacement movement of the other two shapes, which is the circle and the cross. Let's begin with the circle. As we pass from the first to the second frame, we see that it is displaced by one position in the counterclockwise direction on the bottom edge, and if we see the second step, we see that it moves one position more in the same counterclockwise direction, and it ends up on the bottom right corner. Now exactly the same, but in the opposite direction is the displacement movement of the cross, as it moves by one location towards the clockwise direction, peripherally around the square frame. Now the key for determining the correct alternative is to use this particular pattern in order to find the future location of these two shapes, and if we follow the pattern of one position, the periphery of the square frame, for the circle being the counterclockwise direction and the cross being the clockwise direction, then we can safely deduce that the circle and the cross must occupy the locations that it is depicted in the answer choice A, thus it is the correct answer to select for this task. Now let's move on another very typical SHL Inductive Reasoning Test question. Here, as we can see in this particular example, we have a matrix. The matrix is constituted by square frames that inside the frames include either squares, circles or lines. If we delve a little bit deeper, we see that we have two types of lines, horizontal and perpendicular lines. Now, for identifying the pattern in this particular occasion, we need to have a certain degree of experience. It's not that straightforward and it does not fit into the standardized categories, pattern categories that let's dissect the matrix into sequences of rows and let's try to identify the pattern. By looking on the first row, we see from the second square frame in the first row that one horizontal line is included in the same frame as the black circle. Now if we move onto the next frame, we see that we have two pitch black circles with two horizontal lines. So we're starting to see the pattern here. Now let's move on onto the sequence of the second row. Here again we see that we have two black circles and two horizontal lines. Now the second frame, of course, is the one that we are requested to find. So if we pass onto the third frame of the sequence, we see again that we have two black circles and we have two horizontal lines. Now, if we move on the sequence of the third row, we see that we have, from the first square frame, we see that we have three black circles with three horizontal lines. The same holds true for the next frame in the sequence, three black circles, three horizontal lines. And we see onto the third frame that we have two black circles and two horizontal lines. Therefore, if we compile this observation together with the observations that we have made from the past rows, we can deduce that the pattern in this case is that the number of horizontal lines is equal to the number of black circles inside the frame. This observation is, of course, again holds true for the first frame. First row, as we can see, we have none black circle and thus we have no horizontal line. Based on this observation, if we come into the set of the proposed answers, we see that the E, D, C and B are all alternatives that are rejected because they do not follow the pattern that we have just found out. Therefore, the most appropriate answer for this particular task based on the pattern is the answer choice A. Now, let's pass on to the next task. This particular one is considerably more complicated than the task analyzed so far. So without further ado, let's dive into this particular sequence. At first glance in the sequence, we see that the frames are pentagonal and its pentagonal frame is divided into two distinct subsections. One triangular subsection and one trapezoidal subsection located at the bottom of the frame. Look on the first three frames in the sequence, the first three pentagons, you cannot see any observable pattern. It is more or less the appearance of the black dot on the top section of the frame, as well as the gray, the black and the white triangles inside the trapezoidal bottom section of each frame. They are more or less random, so we cannot find any kind of correlation between these two elements. But everything changes if we pass onto the fourth frame in the sequence. Here, as we can see, this frame is different because it includes two distinct black circles, triangle in the frame, which kinda resembles, if we see the previous frames, it resembles the first and the second frame, which we can see it as a synthesis between these two. And indeed this is the case for this pattern, which is a synthesis pattern that is guided by the location of the black circles on the top triangular frame. So, since the location of the black circle is on the top and the bottom right, this clearly indicates that we have a synthesis between the first two frames. Now, the trapezoidal section of the fourth frame is the synthesis result of the previous two. So, with this in mind, with this data that we have here, we can identify the rules that are governing this particular synthesis. We can easily find them by analyzing the formation of each subtriangle inside this sector of the frame. So let's start with the top left triangle. We see that in the first frame, triangle is white, in the second frame in the sequence is gray, and in the fourth frame we paint a gray triangle, which means that a combination of white and gray triangle results into a gray triangle. Now if we move on the next triangle here, if we compare this one with the respective triangle in the second frame in the sequence, we see that we result into a gray triangle. So the second synthesis rule is that when two gray triangles are combined together, this combination gives a gray triangle as a result. Now if we pass again by applying the same logic into the next triangle, this one here, we see that the first frame has a white triangle, the second frame has a white as well, and the fourth frame, the synthesis frame, has a white triangle in this particular location. So the second rule, the third rule, is that when two white triangles are combined together, this results into a white triangle as well. Now if we move into the bottom row triangles and we take the left one, we see that the first frame in the sequence, it contains a black, the second contains a white, so when these two combine together, they give a black triangle, and this is the fourth rule. And the final synthesis rule is that when we have a gray and a black triangle, this combination results into a black triangle. So, if we pass on the final frame in the sequence, and we are requested obviously to find the color of the subtriangles in the trapezoidal section, if we observe the top triangular section of the frame, we see that from the location of the black circles, this frame is the synthesis between the second and the third frame in the sequence. Thus, by applying the format rules that we discussed earlier, in this particular triangle location we have a gray and a white, which will result in a gray triangle. Then the following triangle is gray and gray, which in the final frame in the sequence, in this particular location we need to have a gray triangle as well. The next one is a white and it is combined with a black triangle, so we need to have this particular location a black triangle. And if we move on the bottom row, we have a white and a white, it results in a white triangle, and a black and a gray will result in a black triangle. So the only alternative from the available ones that fully aligns with the format of the triangles that we just discussed is the answer option E. Thus, this is the correct one and this one that we need to take. At this point, we reached the conclusion of our tutorial of the part 2 of this SHL practice test. Well aware that many of these tasks has been discussed in the previous months in other YouTubers' videos, which they provided their own opinions about the solutions and the advice they gave you for effectively resolving the tasks. I don't feel like I align with the information that I have seen from the other channels. Thus, I would like to share my own perspective on how the correct pattern recognition should be made and to give my own thoughts on how you need to resolve these tasks effectively and efficiently. As you probably have realized, many of the tasks that usually included in these psychometric evaluations demand a particular level of experience by the candidate. For those of you who are about to face an inductive reasoning psychometric evaluation as part of your own hiring process, I would like to highly recommend the book Mastering Inductive Reasoning Tests for Corporate Recruitment Purposes, as the book includes a patterns library, which is a thorough registration of every possible pattern that I have encountered in the past when I was going through my own psychometric evaluations and from my own preparation during the past 10 plus years. And this is a database that I created and I share with you so that you do not have to build it from scratch when you are doing your own preparation. Moreover, the book offers 13 practice tests, which offers a plethora of tasks of all possible levels that you might encounter, and thus it is the perfect opportunity for you to test and apply the knowledge that you have gained. Moreover, this book contains some applicable knowledge about the background of these psychometric tests, as well as some advice about strategies, tips and applicable tips that you can apply for maximizing your performance in your evaluation. Now, I would like to thank you all for watching this video. I would like to like and share this video if you found any value, and of course to subscribe, and I promise that I will come back to you in the following weeks with the part 2 of this practice test and some more educational videos regarding this topic. Thank you all, see you again next time.